you very much, Andy and, and Daniel, for the invitation and the warm welcome. So I'm the kind of warm-up act for Andy's presentation on the first substantive piece of work that we've done on the Belfast Climate Commission, which is essentially setting out the pathway to net zero for the city by 2050. So I'll just explain a little bit about the place-based climate action network, of which the Belfast Climate Commission is part, and what the Commission is and what it intends to do. So the place-based climate action network is a 5-year Economic and Social Research Council funded project. It involves 4 universities, you can see them there, including Queen's, Edinburgh, Leeds, where Andy is, and the London School of Economics. And 3 city-based climate commissions. And you can find out more on our website. So it runs until 2024, but I certainly think there's going to be a need for this type of work to continue in terms of the urgency with which climate and decarbonisation is now coming up the political agenda. So this is just going to give you some quotes from our terms of reference of the Belfast Climate Commission, which would be very similar to the other 2 commissions. Essentially, in Belfast, if you live in Belfast, or you may know that last October in 2019, the council, like a lot of other elected bodies, parliaments, declared a climate and ecological emergency. In case you didn't know, the UK Parliament declared one in May 2019. Then it was followed by the Irish Dáil in June. And at last count, Canada, France, Scotland. We've had a lot of these declarations, and the emergence of climate commissions, in a way, is about putting meat on the bones of what does this actually mean. So the role of the commission, in a way, is to be a bit like a think tank for the city, in terms of bringing together public, private, and civil society, environmental stakeholders to try and develop the evidence base for informing decision-making, either by the city, by central government, by local communities, and the business community that I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. So we're trying to bring all these stakeholders together, because it's very clear that there's not one organization, one bit of government, one sector in society, or indeed one discipline. Engineers are going to have a really important role in this. We're also going to need, people interested in policy, in democratic legitimacy. How do we get community buy-in in terms of some of the changes that will be required? Like, for example, most of you would know, listening in on this call, that the decarbonisation of our energy system in the decades ahead heralds the almost complete electrification of our lives. And what does that mean then in terms of change of behaviours? That's my interest, as Andy was reading out, in terms of my research fields of socio-technical transition. How do we begin to, in a way, educate not just our citizens, but indeed our policymakers to speak carbon? To see that there's a carbon footprint in almost everything that we do, but it doesn't really get factored in our thinking. For example, a particular bugbear of mine is how there's no integration of the spatial planning system and energy planning, which to me seems to be an important part of what we need to do in terms of the governance of urban development as we go forward, is the integration of spatial and energy planning. So the idea of the commission is to propagate these ideas at a high level in terms of the evidence base, but also engaging with communities and other key stakeholders, and to be independent. And that's why the report that Andy will present is our first piece of providing the evidence base for looking at the options available to the city if we are going to take seriously that declaration of a climate and ecological emergency by Belfast City Council, which it was also echoed then that in February this year, the Northern Ireland Assembly also declared an emergency as well. What does that actually mean? What does it look like? And that's where, organisations and the evidence base that the Commission can provide is going to be invaluable in the years ahead, particularly, as Andy already indicated, this coming decade is the crucial decade. This is when the heavy lifting needs to be done in terms of making real inroads in decarbonising heat, power, transport, our food system, and almost every part of our ways of life. So our Belfast Commission was the first on the island of Ireland. The very first one, certainly in these islands, is Leeds, the Leeds Climate Commission that Andy Gouldson chairs. But we launched here in Belfast in January. We've established a number of working groups in terms of dividing up, in terms of the division of labour, in terms of how we're going to approach communication, engagement around, particularly the last one I would flag up, the business and finance end, is that where do we find the capital? Where are we going to find the money in terms of public, private, or other sources of investment that's going to be needed? Because these are big ticket items in terms of decarbonising. They will, as Andy's presentation will show, there are savings, considerable savings, and multiple co-benefits to the city that we can see in decarbonisation, but there will be upfront costs in how we do this. Some of them will be cost effective, some of them cost neutral, and some of them a bit more stretch in terms of some of the proposals that we're going to need in the city. So some of the things we've been doing on the Commission since January when we've launched this, we've certainly been engaging with Belfast City Council. The co-chair of the Commission is Grania Long, who's the, well, outgoing Commissioner for Resilience. She's just about to take up a post as the chair of the Chief Executive of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. But it's essentially a partnership between the university and Belfast City Council. We've also had extensive engagement with other councils who are interested in the work of what we've been doing in Belfast, particularly in terms of setting up commissions in other parts of Northern Ireland. There's a really interesting discussion being had at the moment in Derry, Strabane and Donegal about whether it's feasible to set up a climate commission on a cross-border basis. We've also engaged with the Assembly all-party group on climate action. We have extensive meetings, conferences and engagement with particularly the local banks, because there's a stream of work being led out of the London School of Economics on financing the just transition, this whole area of where does the finance come from to fund decarbonisation. And particularly, I have to say, most of the probably energy, to use an appropriate term, on the Commission at the moment is probably in our Community Climate Action Working Group of engaging with young people, engaging with faith communities, for example, trade unions. It does seem to me that this is the type of partnership working that we're going to need in terms of getting all those groups around the table, in terms of everybody having a role to play in communicating, understanding and motivating people, particularly around climate action. And just to begin to wind up and introduce Andy, certainly, and this wouldn't be lost on an audience such as yourselves, that the response to the COVID crisis might be a warm-up for the bigger challenge. You know, is there some positives in terms of how we see the state can move quickly, finance can be found, populations can, at least temporarily and maybe unevenly, radically change their behavior in terms of working from home, wearing masks, social distancing. And so there's a lot of interest certainly on all the commissions and throughout the PCAN network in terms of what are the benefits, the lessons that can be learned from the COVID experience, and in particular around this whole idea of building back better, of, you know, coming out of this crisis in a way that's going to be stronger in terms of laying down some of the foundations for a low carbon green economy. And this is the idea of the importance of a green and inclusive recovery, to see that the crisis can be an opportunity for a step change. And particular, you know, this it goes beyond the pure infrastructural, you know, the hard engineering element of the importance of economic buy-in and legitimacy that we really need, certainly in Northern Ireland, a jobs-led strategy as we come out of this, and maybe not necessarily focusing on ideas of economic growth, for example, but actually jobs, because, you know, sadly, I think many people are unemployed. They just don't know it because of the furlough scheme and so on. So the idea here, of course, is to try and use this crisis as an opportunity to, you know, come out of this stronger and see where are the green jobs. And actually, there's quite a lot of economic analysis that show that some of the best job potentials lie in a green recovery, and particularly not returning to normal, because normal was the problem in many ways. Normal was actually unsustainable in terms of its dependence upon carbon, long globalized supply chains, not inclusive, not everybody was benefiting. So again, it's a kind of a reset opportunity we have with the pandemic, and this idea, so rather than resilience, which is usually seen in a kind of conservative manner of bouncing back, well, what about bouncing forward and using the opportunity to transform rather than simply be resilient? And that does mean then perhaps looking at issues of a different economic model. And we are having some discussions on the Commission and indeed elsewhere about what does selective relocalizing of the economy, is that an option? Can we use the rather large public procurement budgets of, say, the Belfast Social, the NHS Trust or City Council or the University in Belfast? These are, millions of pounds of procurement. Can they be used better to relocalize the economy, protect local jobs and so forth, particularly as we face to, not just the pandemic and the climate crisis, we've also got Brexit to throw into the mix here as well. So just to finish up, this is, I think, again, to maybe tee up some questions and discussions, particularly after Andy's talk, in terms of seeing that the crisis is an opportunity to do things differently. This is a quote that some of you may or may not know, that, Milton Friedman, very, strong neoliberal, certainly wouldn't be my political cup of tea. I'm much further to the left, but this was a great hero of the likes of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But this is one thing everything else I disagree with him, but I think he was quite correct in saying that this is the idea of seeing that crisis is about seeing new things. What was once impossible now becomes credible, particularly around the importance of states actually becoming much more powerful as an actor in the economy. And certainly I think it goes without saying that the green transition will not happen without a heavy state involvement. Now, how that takes place, everything from nationalization to states setting up frameworks and providing some maybe seed capital, if not the whole lot. There's a whole range of issues to be considered there. And if you're interested in my own thoughts on this is actually from lockdown part 1, when I clearly had too much time on my hands, where I was trying to look at what are the lessons from the pandemic. And it seems to me that, one thing we can say is that, we have these declarations of climate and ecological emergencies, but then there's often very little action. I think the pandemic shows us what a real emergency looks like: determined, swift action by states and by populations. How can that be then translated into the climate space? And particularly for yourselves listening, what's the role of engineers and engineering in this? Is it to be reactive and wait to see what states or the way the markets are moving, or actually is it to be proactive and actually start being informed by the likes of Andy's report in terms of saying that this is the roadmap for the future, and therefore to get ahead of the curve as opposed to be reactive? So the pandemic, I think, has revealed a lot of structural weaknesses in our local and national economies, and certainly something we're discussing in the Commission, and particularly around globalization. Now, I know this is, in some respects, going outside of strictly kind of infrastructural engineering, buildings, roads, fabric, and so on, in terms of that very limited or very strict understanding of engineering. But I do think this is the context in which we have to understand almost everything we do now, that it's not just a matter of engineering, technical aspects. There's also policy, there's also democracy, there's also legitimacy. Does it economically make sense? All of these have to come together, which is, again, the importance of not just partnership working, but interdisciplinary working, of seeing that different disciplines now have a role to play. If we're facing a planetary crisis, we need to throw everything we have at it and not just say that that's just an engineering issue or that's a normal policy response, which I think would be a severe danger. Our societies are extremely unequal. That, again, is not an engineering issue so far, unless you want to understand engineering as extending simply beyond bridges and buildings and so forth, to do with how we organize and design our economies, not something of my own academic interest as a political economist. What about, we've now seen that key workers are some of the most important, obviously, in society. It's very gendered, the high levels of female employment, for example, in the caring and health professions, and actually they're also very well, exposed to precarious work as well. So there's bigger issues in terms of the structural weaknesses of our economy. And to go back to what I said earlier, we have a looming unemployment crisis. So how can we get ahead of that as we build back better to make sure there are green jobs in a low carbon economy? And there's some salutary figures from the New Economics Foundation in terms of how many millions of people are going to be unemployed in the UK as we come back. So how are we going to address this in terms of providing good, decent pay and conditions in terms of work for all these people? And that's the reality that we're facing, is that the pandemic has revealed quite a lot of the weaknesses that many of us saw before, but now I think it's there for all of us to see. And that's all by way of teeing up Andy in terms of presenting this report here, our net zero carbon roadmap for Belfast, which was written, just as the pandemic was, increasing in its severity. So it does have within it aspects of this building back better in terms of what are our, cost-effective options for Belfast. But of course, Belfast as such a, user of resources and energy for Northern Ireland and the regional economy as a whole, that when we say we've produced a carbon roadmap for Belfast, it can be extended, I think, to other parts of Northern Ireland. And we hope that the methodology that Andy will outline now and what we've found in Belfast could be replicated in other cities, whether it's in Dublin or Cardiff, Paris, and so on. I think it is a transferable methodology. And I think we are going to see more and more carbon roadmaps being produced by cities, because really, just to finish, not only is the future bright, the future is green in terms of not the usual way green is understood in our part of the world, but in terms of electrification and low carbon energy. But it's also clear that the level of governance we're going to see a much more important emphasis on, as not to say the nation state isn't going to still be important, but it really is going to be at the city and the city region level that I think we're going to see most of the innovation. So in terms of scale, I think it's that city region level between, the macro level of the nation state and the micro level of individual businesses and households, is that meso level of the city. And I think this is, an excellent first step in the right direction to help us try and understand this for Belfast and the wider regional Northern Ireland economy. So I'll finish there and hand over to Andy.
Many thanks, John. Andy, you should be able to share a screen.
Mm-hmm.
Just a reminder for anyone wanting to pose questions to populate the chat box. We have one so far. It should be an interesting one, but I'm sure there's going to be plenty more to follow. And before Andy gets going properly, just a special mention to Jane McCullough, who is Climate NI Director. She nominated 2 speakers this evening. Certainly deserves thanks to her. Andy, off you go.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is a new report which is coming out in the next 3 or 4 weeks. We're going to give you some sneaky highlights of that report and talk you through the methods behind it, but also the implications of the analysis. We've done these kind of roadmaps for Leeds and Edinburgh at the same time, but also for multiple other cities around the world in the past. And they have a big role to play in mobilizing people and turning what can be an overwhelming challenge into a more deliverable suite of programs and projects. And that's a key thing, I think, in terms of breaking the inertia and enabling people to move forward. One of the other things they can do is to help mainstream the climate agenda. So instead of delegating it to what are often rather peripheral and poorly resourced environment sustainability departments on the side of a local authority or a city council, by presenting the economic case for climate action, you can changed the tone of the argument from a threat and a worry to an opportunity and something to be positive about. And I think COVID at the moment has really highlighted the role that investment in low carbon could play in stimulating our economy, but also in tackling some of the social problems, especially to do with fuel poverty and inequality in public health as we move forward. So that repositioning of environment into the heart of housing or transport or infrastructure or land use planning is absolutely vital in tackling the climate challenge. And all of the resources in those areas are going to be vital to, we have to mobilize them in order to achieve the kind of carbon cuts that are required, which is what we'll talk about now. If I can change my screen, here we go. Right, so this infographic charts the roadmap in simple forms, but broadly it's widely known and established now that we should be aiming to limit global warming or climate change on average to 1.5 degrees. There was a landmark report out 2 or 3 years ago now, which said that many of the thresholds that we need to not go across if we're to avoid getting into the realms of runaway or dangerous climate change, where climate change starts fueling itself and therefore we lose control of our future. Many of those thresholds are more likely to be at 1.5 than 2 degrees, which doesn't sound like much, but in terms of net zero, basically that's behind whether we aim for 80% carbon cuts by 2050 or net zero by much sooner, ideally. At the moment, at a global scale, we're heading towards having emitted all that we can emit to get to that threshold by 2030. So really, it's all about what we can do in the next decade, which is why the UN's talks in Glasgow this time next year are so crucial. They involve upgrading the Paris commitments and every country being asked to, first of all, report on the progress they've made towards delivering those, but secondly, to pledge further commitments for the next 5 years. So if you take the global carbon budget available to stay within 1.5 degrees and divide it just by population, very simply, then Belfast's carbon budget to stay within 1.5 degrees, or share of the global carbon budget, is 14 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And at the moment, our analysis suggests that Belfast is emitting 1.5 million tons a year. And that means Belfast, like similar to the global scale, Belfast will have used its share of the global carbon budget by 2030. So it's all about the next decade in Belfast as well as globally. And we'll go into the next statistics in a bit more detail in a second, but Belfast is currently 42% down on its 2000 levels of emissions. So that's good progress in some respects. But when you look at the science-based targets, and again, we'll look at those in a bit more detail in a minute, that 42% needs to be 66% by 2025. So in other words, roughly half of what it's done in the last 20 years, it needs to do in the next 5 years, or maybe even 4 years. And that needs to be 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. As long as Belfast or anywhere else really meets its targets by 2030, what happens afterwards is less crucial. As long as we've had an 80% carbon cut by then, the tail of emissions won't be so significant, not insignificant, but not so crucial. So again, that reinforces the view it's all around what happens between now and 2030. So compared to business as usual, there's a gap between where Belfast is headed if it doesn't do anything more and where it needs to be to stay within its carbon budget. And again, we'll go through all of this in more detail, but we think that Belfast could close that gap by a little more than a third, just by doing the economic no-brainer stuff that ought to pay for itself just through the energy savings it generates, and also then generate wider benefits in terms of reduced congestion or better air quality, or reduced fuel poverty or improved public health or job creation. And our analysis suggests that Belfast could create nearly 5,000 jobs. or years of extra employment, excuse me. So that's the equivalent of 500 jobs for 10 years, or you know, divided over what period you like. But if it did that by 2030, it would create 500 jobs for throughout that 10-year period, and save £263 million a year from its energy bill. So at the moment, that's money that's leaking out of the Belfast economy. A little like a household that's inefficient, it doesn't need to leak out. It could stay in the household budget or the city budget and create prosperity and well-being at the city scale. We then also predict that Belfast could more than halve the gap if it did everything that we already know about, and that is cost neutral. So again, it needn't be a massive cost to do the first half of what needs to be done by 2050. However, that still leaves a gap. And when we look at some of the stretch options, and again, I'll go through those shortly, we forecast that Belfast could close those gaps and reach carbon neutrality by 2033. But to do that, there's a lot of ambition, and a lot of investment, and an awful lot of delivery of low carbon options needed. So to go into all of that in a little bit more detail, this is Belfast's carbon footprint from the year 2000 up to now, and then projected out to 2050. And that projection includes economic growth at 1.5% a year. It includes population change. It improves an ongoing shift towards more efficient houses and more efficient vehicles, and so on, and it includes decarbonisation of electricity. So what this shows is that, you know, there have been some significant progress, especially in the last 5 years or so, but that moving forward, it looks like that will kind of plateau through to 2050. So really then we are, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor if I'm wobbling it around. Can you see that? I'll assume you can. So there's a gap between the dotted line here, which is the business as usual forecast by 2050, and the net zero point, which is down here, which is 0 by 2050. So the question then is, well, how do we close that gap? In terms of the sectoral breakdown, then currently households account for 39% of the carbon footprint of Belfast, and public and commercial buildings 24%, transport 20%, and industry 18%. So that's a higher proportion for households than in many other cities in the UK, but a lower proportion for transport. And moving out to 2050, we project that the carbon footprint will be a bit smaller, but the households will create 50% of the carbon footprint of the city by then. So what happens in households, and therefore retrofit and new build become crucial, is absolutely central to determining Belfast's carbon footprint moving forward. But when we look at the business as usual projection and instead the science-based targets, then as I was saying in the introduction with that infographic, we need to reduce emissions much more quickly. So 66% by 2025, 80% by 2030, 88% by 2035, and then drifting down to 100% by 2050. These are known as science-based targets because they just take that global carbon budget, which is compatible with staying within 1.5 degrees, and divide it by population. So it's quite a challenge to switch from that higher dotted line, which is almost flat, to that lower dotted line, which approaches net zero by 2050. So the question is, well, how do we do that? What are the options? So this graph, I'm sorry, the key at the bottom is broken for some reason. The lightest pink shade underneath the flat dotted line is the cost-effective options. So these are options which would more than pay for themselves. The middle shaded pink is the cost-neutral options. So this is no net cost to the city, and that can get you to 50% of that gap being closed. The darker red is stuff we already know about, which is technically viable, but not economic on direct grounds at the moment. So this may be things like public transport, which rarely pays for itself directly, but instead creates wider benefits in terms of, you know, access to labor markets and connectivity and congestion and so on. So the good news is that Belfast, with existing options, we think can get to 60% or so that gap between where it's headed and where it needs to be being closed. Now, this is a slightly sobering slide because it talks about the investment needs. To open up those cost-effective opportunities would require investments of £1.6 billion a year. And those investments spread over 10 years would be 160 million, which sounds a bit more palatable. They would reduce the city's energy bill by £286 million a year by 2050 and create all that employment that we talked about at the beginning. So that option ought to be fairly straightforward relatively, but then as we get more and more ambitious, the costs escalate. So cost neutral involves investing £4 billion and opening up technical potential and doing everything we know about now would be £5 billion. So there's an obvious question here about how on earth do you stimulate that level of investment? A key point is it's not only down to government to do that. Some of that will happen naturally as people upgrade their vehicles or their cars, or as companies improve their energy efficiency. And then, you know, government can stimulate this by through feed-in tariffs or revolving funds or municipal bonds. And there are various financing options coming through quickly to reduce that investment need or address that investment need more accurately. We can go through these in questions if you'd like to hear more. In terms of the top 10 carbon reduction options, well, the biggest one is insulating homes by quite a distance. And then the next most carbon effective thing would be to switch from petrol cars to cycling. So Belfast needs a much more aggressive cycling strategy. And then you can go down through the list. I won't go through all of them, but upgrading heating controls in homes is also significant. Switching petrol car journeys to walking. So that means cycling and walking together as active travel and what some of the most carbon effective things that can happen. And then you can go down through the list. What's interesting from this is that there are obviously some technical and engineering challenges in some of those areas, but these are things we're generally quite familiar with. And really it's not about what to do, it's more about how to do it. And you know, there may be a need for improving delivery capabilities, for example, to retrofit all of the city's homes to a high level in the next 10 years. Are there the skills there? Is there the institutional infrastructure there in terms of building controls or supply chains or skills provision and so on? And these are real challenges, as well as stimulating the finance to enable that level of investment and change. And then quickly moving on to look at the last segment. So what happens after we've done everything we know about? So that the baseline is the black dotted line here, and the red dotted line is technical potential, doing everything we know about. If we then look at some stretch options, which I'll show you in a second, we can then get further down to the red and pink shaded area under the gray. And then if we did a massive tree planting scheme, and I'll explain how massive in a minute, that would offset the residual emissions equivalent to the grey areas. So that suggests that all of this is possible, that Belfast, using existing options and some of these stretch options, could get to net zero by 2037 or 2038. And as new options come forward, then new things become possible, and it may well be possible to get to net zero earlier. And these are the stretch options we looked at. So one was looking at the use of hydrogen for heavy goods vehicles. And that could deliver the carbon savings that you can see there in the table, especially using renewable energy to create the hydrogen. Also then switching industrial heating and cooling to electrification, and the same lower down for domestic heat, domestic cooking, and commercial and public buildings heating. So all of those are reasonably familiar. I think there are still some challenges, especially with hydrogen, but interesting to hear from you as a community of engineers how viable you think that would be in the next 10 years. But electrification of heating, especially with the rapid expansion of wind energy, could well deliver significant carbon cuts. And the residual then involves planting 1,400 hectares of forest in Belfast or around in Northern Ireland. So that's the amount needed to offset everything left once you've done everything that we can think of in these other sectors. And to give you a sense of the size of the scale of that, that would involve planting 62 million trees, which even with the densest possible planting would require an area which is 122% size, the size of Belfast city limits as it stands. So that's not really there as a real option. It's there to illustrate, you know, just how much tree planting would be needed as a way of saying, well, that really just shows we need to do all of these other things. So that's the end of the presentation. But just to conclude, I think what this means is that we need, and there's a huge opportunity now through a recovery package to really prioritize low carbon investment. And the first wave can be hugely economically and socially beneficial, as well as environmentally beneficial, and therefore could play a central role in a green recovery plan. The later stages, it gets more challenging. You know, we can be optimistic and hope that by the time we get there, that the costs and benefits have changed and our capacity to do these things have improved. But really what this then is going to need is policy change at the Northern Ireland and the Belfast level, but also at the UK scale and internationally. It's going to need new investment models and new business models for raising that and channeling that level of finance. There's a lot of work going on those at the moment, especially within PCAN. And then it's going to need a social license, if you like, a lot of buy-in from the public. And to get that, I think we need to really have a positive vision of what a low carbon or a net zero Belfast can look like by 2050 that people can get excited about and opt into and think, that's the city I want to live in. So I'll finish there. Thank you.